Professor Alice Hunt, welcome to The Next Generation.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
So let's take ourselves back in time to January 30th, 1649. Charles I, he's been marched up onto scaffolds outside the banquet house in London, and he has his head on the block. What has led England to be about to commit regicide?
Yeah, exactly. The most extraordinary event to happen ever in British history, I think, to execute a king in broad daylight. It'd been a long road to this point, nearly a decade of terrible civil wars that had torn the country apart. And those wars did not set out to bring down the monarchy. The wars between the parliamentarians on the one side and the king and the royalists on the other really set out to define monarchy, to bring about or to put pressure on the king to agree to certain terms to the office of being a monarch, to agree to rule with Parliament, to acknowledge Parliament, because Charles I had ruled for 11 years without Parliament. Parliament was summoned and dissolved in the early modern period by the monarch. And Charles I, it was within his rights not to rule with Parliament, but it really caused problems between him and his House of Commons. And he refused to negotiate. I mean, the wars were terrible. There were endless opportunities for him to agree terms with the parliamentarians, to agree to a different kind of monarchy. But that wasn't the kind of monarch that Charles I was. He absolutely believed that he was accountable to God only. And that any kind of shaving off of his power would be tantamount to sort of destroying monarchy, to not being a monarch. He said, I would just be the kind of sign of a king. So when it became clear that he was not going to negotiate, a very sort of hardened group of parliamentarians and army officers decided that the only way they could see through this was to actually get rid of the king. Or to at least bring him to account. So they put him on trial. Not everyone was behind this, of course. And the House of Commons, only certain MPs within the House of Commons agreed to push through the trial. Others were forced out. Anyone who didn't want to put the king on trial, those MPs were purged. So it was a very small, truncated House of Commons that forced through the trial.
It seems different to most of these key events that we witness in history, especially when it's other countries fighting against England. This is a civil war, and Parliament actually give Charles plenty of opportunities to change his ways, but he never does. He's constantly out fighting foreign wars that he can't win, leveraging more and more taxpayers' money.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
To me, it seems like Parliament are actually very, very generous to him over the decades.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And I think even amongst those parliamentarians, there were many who were, real monarchists who absolutely were loyal to Charles I and wanted to give him all of these opportunities. But we've really got two different understandings of what a monarch is here. A monarch who is above Parliament, or a monarch who rules with Parliament. And Charles I saw himself as the former. And there were many grievances. There were also religious grievances, which Parliament wanted to wanted Charles to address, particularly the idea that he was a king whose religious preferences were looking a little bit too Catholic. So there were both political and religious pressures on him. And yes, plenty of time to negotiate, and plenty of time even for it not to end up with it being a death sentence during the trial. He could have entered a plea. He did not plead, Charles I, to be either to be innocent or guilty. And if you don't enter a plea, it's likely that you're found guilty. If he had I think you could argue if he had agreed and acknowledged some of the things that he had done, and with the part that he had played in the wars, there might have been a different outcome. But he chose the route of martyrdom. I think he knew he would be found guilty. He knew that would probably end with his death, and as such, he created, almost before he was killed, the sense that he was going to be a kind of martyr, sacrificed by the parliamentarians.
I really want to hammer home this point of the divine right of kings and how different it was to be alive under the rule of such a leader. I mean, I couldn't imagine living under that, and it still happens today in other countries. So I think it would be really useful just to hang on that point a little bit, and maybe you could explain what society would have looked like, what the general attitude was towards their ruler.
Mm-hmm. It's first and foremost a religious understanding, and I think that's something that is hard for us to imagine and go back in time to a society where the belief in God was all-consuming, and to not believe in God was not really an option, and to believe that God legitimized the rulers, that God had chosen kings, that they were set apart from ordinary people. James I, Charles I's father, famously wrote about what it was to be a king, and he says a king is God's lieutenant on earth. So the king is a representative of God and accountable only to God. And this is why Charles I resists being put on trial. He says, I cannot be put on trial by my subjects, by you. I am accountable to God only. We would find this very hard to accept now. The king has to rule on behalf of Parliament, on the advice of ministers, and yet there are still remnants of this belief. I mean, Charles III, when he crowned, he had to promise to be a Protestant king. His coronation was a religious service and a duty and an oath to his people, but also to God. We still have the shadows of this belief there. And as you say, in some countries there is a belief that whoever is in a position of authority is still sort of untouchable. But we haven't completely got rid of that. And to the kind of charisma of a monarch is still there.
Yeah, there are all these remnants and clues of our past, and it begs the question, I guess, do you think this patience with Charles I was partly just the British couldn't let go of having this idol to look up to and worship, just like we still can't, even though, as we all know, Christianity's declining. I know on the 2021 census, people that ticked the box, whether they were Christian or not, it was the category that fell the most in percentage. So even though it's been falling, and to draw a parallel, even though back then he's saying he's got the divine right from God, but he's making all these mistakes and screwing over the country, the people just can't let go.
Yes, I mean, and sort of who are the people there? As a sort of whole range of different ideas, but I think what you're saying is that what society had and couldn't sort of reimagine was a form of government that wasn't monarchical, that didn't have a single person at its head, and that single person would not be an elected office, but a hereditary office. So appointed by God, but also that appointment would follow the rules of hereditary power, and that there was something special in kind of royal blood. There was sort of sacred blood, and this was something that was understood to happen at the coronation. That they were imbued with God's grace. That they had sort of magical properties, that a king, and Charles II in exile would claimed that if he hadn't been crowned, he was still a kind of sacred being and could heal people on account of his touch. So it's very hard to replace that. There were, of course, other models of republics. They could look elsewhere. They could look to Poland, which was an elected monarchy. They could look across the water to Holland, which was a pretty royal republic, but a republic nonetheless. They could look to Venice, which was a republic. They could look to the classics, to Greek and Roman republics. There were models, and as it became apparent that Britain was ending up kind of being a republic, those models were looked at. But imagining that earlier, during the 1620s, 30s, and 40s, was harder. There was a kind of republican. There were republican thinkers. Someone like Shakespeare was interested in alternatives and in republics and looked to Rome and Greece. But to actually build that kind of constitution in Britain, a really difficult thing to do. Where do you start, actually? What kind of republic do you want to, will you kind of agree on?
So take me through. You've mentioned that Charles fails to make any attempt at reconciling what's happened. He wants to be a martyr. I think I read somewhere that he had his sort of royal correspondence and they do plead for forgiveness, and then they get executed as well anyway. Take me through now to the execution. What unfolds? He's been tried, he's guilty, he's sort of this school kid that keeps on misbehaving, the teachers love him, he's got potential, he's got a bit of talent, and they really don't want to expel him, but he's punched up the nerd in the class and it's time. That's unacceptable. He's got to go. What unfolds at the execution?
Yes, he didn't he didn't take the advice that he was being given. The execution was a public execution, so in broad daylight, on Whitehall, outside the banqueting house, which still stands. The only building, only kind of remnant of the Palace of Whitehall that is still there, along with the very old Westminster Hall. This beautiful building, quite new building, an absolute kind of symbol of monarchy, and it's outside that building that the scaffold is built, and he is processed through St. James's Park and into the banqueting house and out onto a scaffold. He has to sort of clamber through a window. It's freezing cold. There are thousands of people, by all accounts, watching, and a really mixed group: soldiers, noblemen, men and women, ordinary men and women, courtiers, foreigners. Samuel Pepys, the famous diarist, is a young boy, 15 years old, should have been at school, but played truant. Wouldn't you, if something like this was happening in your city down the road? You would think, I want to see this. Everyone knew that this was an extraordinary thing to be happening. When the axe came down, another observer called Philip Henry heard a groan. He says, I heard a groan that I've never heard before. Some people rushed forward to try and get some of the royal blood that had been spilt. This was kind of the beginning of the kind of cult of martyrdom around Charles I, because he was a king. They wanted sort of relics of him, and his blood was sacred. He had given a speech on the scaffold. He had said, "I'm a martyr of the people." He had stooped down. He had tucked his hair back up into his cap, and his head was held aloft. And the masked executioner said, "Behold, the head of a traitor." So to some, a martyr; to others, a traitor. And that's what he had been found guilty of, being a tyrant, traitor, murderer, someone who had failed to protect the people because he had waged war on them. And then this execution was over. His body was taken away. His head was stitched back on crudely. He was given a funeral. I mean, there was some dignity. that was very important for the regime to look as if what they'd been doing was legitimate, public, that they were doing things properly, that they were affording a king some dignity. And then they had to work out what to do. They had to work out how to make what would be the next move. And they abolished monarchy. Not straight away, but pretty quickly. An act of parliament was passed which abolished monarchy, declaring it useless and dangerous. The House of Lords also was dismissed. So now we're we are now, in the unprecedented, uncharted territory of one chamber, just the House of Commons, and no single person at its head.
Talk me through some of the key players in this. Let's get on to the likes of Cromwell, Pride. How involved is Cromwell leading up to the execution? A lot of people seem to think that he was the only sole perpetrator of this regicide. Who are the key players?
Yeah, no. Yeah, that's because Cromwell has become kind of synonymous with the period as a whole because of what happens to him a few years after this. But Cromwell is well known at this time as the right-hand man of Sir Thomas Fairfax, who was the architect and leader of the New Model Army. And the Royalists began to lose terribly in the civil wars once the New Model Army kind of had got going under Fairfax. And then Cromwell, who before becoming a soldier was a gentleman farmer. He did enter Parliament in the early 1640s as a member of Parliament and did sort of join the voices that were criticising Charles I. He wasn't involved with Colonel Pride and the purge of Parliament. That's the purge of the House of Commons to enable them to put the king on trial. He wasn't in London then. He possibly was in Whitehall at the moment of the execution and apparently went along and saw the body of Charles I. But he is known to be ambitious and he is known to be ruthless on the battlefield. But he is not making all the decisions. We've got a kind of group of men in Parliament who then become a council, and they become the Executive Council, and there are 40 of them, and Cromwell is among them. And he does take the chair of that council, but its first president is someone called John Bradshaw, who's a judge from Cheshire, and he had presided over the trial. So Cromwell was among a group of parliamentarians, politicians who had pushed through the trial. He had signed the death warrant, but he wasn't the ringleader. And soon after the execution, the Council of State, this is now this body of people who are the executive, sent him off to Ireland to quell a royalist uprising in Ireland and to bring Ireland back under the control of England. Ireland was had been a kind of rebellious colony in the 1640s. So Cromwell is not in England and not at Westminster for all of 1649. He doesn't come back till 1650.
How long after that is the Rump Parliament formed? Is that just a general term for the Parliament straight after the execution, or is that an official body of people?
The Rump Parliament is the term that's used to describe the Parliament once it's been purged in December 1648. So this is to enable a very kind of fiery army officer called Henry Ireton, who's Cromwell's son-in-law. He has been pushing for the king possibly to be brought to account. And when a decision is made that they have to purge Parliament, because not all MPs are going to allow the king to be put on trial. This is not what they want. That Parliament is purged, and Colonel Pride is someone who he's the kind of the army officer tasked with actually refusing certain MPs to enter. that parliament, the Purge Parliament, is then known by the insult the Rump. A Rump Parliament with corrupt faggots in it is one of the quotations, because it's just a tale of a parliament. It's not a full parliament, and it's known as the Rump Parliament until that parliament is dismissed in 1653.
So we've got this Rump Parliament. They've sent Cromwell off to Ireland. Why have they waited to do that until after the execution? Is it a religious thing? Is it England trying to get more land? Why have they waited for after Charles I?
Because the threat from Ireland becomes very real after the execution of Charles I, because Ireland, as well as Scotland, have declared in favour of Charles II. They have proclaimed Charles Stuart, Charles I's son, as their king, and Charles Stuart, future Charles II, is in communication with supporters in Ireland and in Scotland, and it's a preemptive strike. They think Ireland is going to stage an attack on England on behalf of Charles II to win the throne back for him. So that's why they send these exhausted soldiers over to Ireland. They've been fighting for a long time. They haven't been paid for a while. I mean, they have to go, and Cromwell leads them.
Well, before we get into Ireland, which I think is necessary for us to discuss in this revolutionary decade, as you call it, I'd love for us to just go back to the basics, the differences between the Protestants and Catholics, a brief synopsis, 1 minute, of the entire history. Protestants, Catholics, why is there that tension there? Why are they doing a preemptive strike against Ireland?
Well, it's a preemptive strike against Ireland for supporting Charles Stuart, future Charles II. They're not all Catholics, because Ireland has been colonised for a long time, since the reign of Henry VIII. So what the situation in Ireland is a combination of old Irish Catholics who have then been who then had to sort of give way to old English Catholics who moved to Ireland. And then after the Reformation of Henry VIII, this is going back to the early 16th century, old English Protestants. So what happens in Ireland is that you have a kind of uneasy coalition, actually, of Protestants and Catholics who are supporting the king, because neither of them wanted the execution of Charles I. There are also some rebel Catholics who are resisting the rule of England, and they are. So there you have got the kind of tension there between Catholics and Protestants. You asked me to describe the differences between Protestants and Catholics, and I suppose really what the Reformation was in England. So when England broke from the Catholic Church under Henry VIII, England, formerly Catholic country, was sort of forced to become Protestant. It was seen at the time as a reformed Catholicism, actually, that a kind of purer kind of Catholicism, more faithful to the true church, one that hadn't been corrupted, particularly by the Pope and by Rome. Main differences: the Catholic Church recognises the Pope as the head of the church, and in Protestant England, the head of the church was not the Pope. The head of the church was the monarch.
And let's keep on going with these terms, because I often watch different podcasts about this time period, and people sort of assume a prior knowledge of all these different groups. So it'd be nice to just get into Puritanism as well, the Levelers. Who are all these different groups that are branching off and butting heads a little bit?
Yeah. Well, the Reformation wasn't a neat process. And Protestantism took many different forms and took a long, long time to settle down. It wasn't as if England became Protestant overnight at all. So what we see in the 1620s, 30s, 40s is what is a kind of continuation of the Reformation and tension between groups who want to reform the country more and more. So you can have kind of Protestants who want to get rid of some of the Catholic ceremonies, but not necessarily all of them. And you can and Protestants who really want the church to go even further, who want to pull down any kind of remnants of superstition or popishness. And those kinds of Protestants become known as the Puritans in the 16th century. And it's an insult at first. But the Puritans we can understand as what a historian called Patrick Collinson famously called the hotter kind of Protestants. So they're Protestants, but they want the church to be reformed even further, to be even purer. They very much privilege the word of God, and preaching, but they share with Protestants in England belief in predestination, the Calvinist doctrine that you are either elect or damned. So they share that, but they are pushing against the particular kind of strands of the church that they see as not being reformed fully enough.
They want everything more boring. It becomes a bit of a boring off. This transcendence into Puritanism and who can have the most bland table covering, who can strip off the most paintings and get rid of Christmas the fastest.
Yes, they don't want ceremonies that aren't recognised by the Bible, so they don't like Christmas in particular. They don't want there to be recreations on Sundays, on the Sabbath day. They don't like sort of images and icons, so they want to strip the church further of any kind of remnants of images of saints or any kind of ceremonialism. So and the altar is a kind of interesting kind of symbol of how reformed the church might be. Protestants and Puritans particularly wanted the altar not to be like a kind of high table, but to be like an ordinary kind of kitchen table, positioned in the church in a way that was accessible to all. They wanted the church, I think, to feel much more accessible, to feel much more informal, much more of a connection with the Word of God, without all the kind of the mystery and the ritual of a less reformed Protestant church.
We've got Cromwell. He's a Puritan, and he is sent to the mostly Catholic Ireland. What comes next? How brutal is this? I've heard numerous times that mentioning Cromwell's name, even today in Ireland, is the equivalent of sort of saying Voldemort's name in Harry Potter. He's really looked down on, and I don't know if this is true, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but I even saw somewhere that during this whole period, about a fifth of the population of Ireland is killed. How much truth is there in that? How extreme is this military expedition? What happens?
It is a brutal response from the Cromwell and his army. What follows after he has kind of conquered Ireland is a kind of huge kind of redistribution of land in Ireland, whereby many of Catholics are pushed to the far west, and a kind of huge distribution of land. Why he's vilified in Ireland is particularly because of his behaviour and his soldiers' behaviour in two places. in 1649. Drogheda, a port up in the north, and Wexford further down in the south, where his soldiers seem to have killed, probably not deliberately, but did kill women and civilians and children who were caught up in the battles, the sieges of Drogheda and Wexford. What is less easy to argue, there's not enough evidence to say that Cromwell himself ordered these massacres. But it is very contentious, his behaviour there. And the treatment of the Irish and the taking of their land afterwards is, an act of a brutal act of colonialism, and that's probably how it should, it should be seen on a par with other colonial conquests that England participated in that century and then beyond.
Do you think that was pre-planned, or do you think it was more opportunistic? Because from what I've seen of Cromwell, he sets out pretty harsh criteria to his soldiers beforehand, and they seem to go out there with a fair amount of discipline in terms of how they're meant to treat the Irish. But then I don't know if it's opportunistic or if he knew deep down that he was always going to take all of this land. Which one do you think it was?
Oh, well, the brief was to conquer Ireland. I mean, to bring it back under English control, to make them acknowledge that they were subservient to England. And that was in that Cromwell was following a foreign policy for many years. His attitude towards conquering the Irish, and both as a kind of colonial act, but also because Catholicism and the Pope was the kind of the Antichrist, were on a par with what Elizabeth I had wanted to do, and James I and Charles I. He wasn't exceptional in this, and I think that it's important to understand that the attitude and the views that he had of Ireland were shared by many back home in England. So we should look at attitudes that England as a whole had towards Ireland over this period, and not just Cromwell, but that he possibly lost control of his soldiers to a certain extent in Drogheda and Wexford, maybe. But you're right, there were terms of warfare at this time. You weren't allowed to kill if they had dropped arms. And if you had to acknowledge surrender, you had to give a city the opportunity to surrender, which he does in both places, and at Wexford. It's while they're negotiating the terms of surrender that it all sort of starts to go wrong. I don't think you can say it was pre-planned, but I think that you can point to moments where Cromwell gets quite caught up in the heat of the moment, and there are reports of soldiers on the battlefield, and they sort of describe him as becoming kind of intoxicated, as almost looking sort of slightly mad when he's in the middle of a fight. But I don't think we can argue that he went out there, not caring if he committed atrocities. But he did go out wanting to conquer Ireland, and he did go, and the intention was after that there would be distribution of land. Absolutely.
So Cromwell finishes his role in Ireland. He goes back to England.
He's welcomed as a hero when he comes back, which is, important. This is his kind of moment that he's really praised and thanked by Parliament for what he's done. Sorry, interrupted you.
No, it's crucial to the story. He's praised, and then he uses this praise to eventually work his way up to becoming Lord Protector. How do we get from this republic to a protectorate? What are the key differences there?
Okay, so you've interestingly said, Eliot, that he uses this to work his way up, as if he always had an end game, that he wanted power. Very difficult to pin Cromwell down. He says things which are at odds with what he does. So he says things like, I never sought this position. But he was ambitious, but he's also quite inscrutable. But what happens when he comes back from Ireland is that he's praised and he's thanked, and he's given some rooms in some lodgings in Whitehall, which he and his family can move into, and he is his voice carries a lot of weight. You know, he's powerful.
Well, let's linger on that point for a moment. I think it's fascinating, and studying history and the likes of Stalin, who does all these different plays. He's once called the Grey Blur because he's so boring and forgettable, but then he makes this great left turn, gets rid of different cabinet members, and he's always seemingly got this end game and master plan to become the leader of the Soviet Union. There are so many examples of that throughout history, whereas Cromwell is harder to pin down, but I just don't know if I can believe that someone couldn't go all the way to Lord Protector without that ambition and a deep down feeling, as I think is described, of duty.
Yeah, it's a good point. And certainly royalist satirists saw this ambition and thought that he was hankering after a crown from quite early on. So I think that's an astute point, but whether he actually, what form he wanted the power to take, I'm not sure. But I think what he does do, and what he's very moved by, is the sense that they've had these enormous victories, both in England in the civil wars, and then in Ireland, and then in Scotland, which is in 1650, another huge victory. And he believes that these are God's victories. So we're back again to trying to imagine what it's like to think that God might be on your side, and that's not just a kind of thing that you say, but to kind of cover your own ambition, but actually to try to take that seriously. Now, there is ambition too, but I think we have to take seriously that belief that God is acting for them, and that God himself is moving against these other forces and wanting something to happen in England. And he says these are God's victories. And he then says we need to acknowledge this. We need to reform this country. We now need to go further with what we're doing. And he gets so frustrated with the Rump Parliament, who are sitting back in Westminster and, as he perceives it, not doing what they should be doing. They're not putting themselves up for election. They need to. This is not a legitimate parliament. But they need to put themselves up for election in such a way that they don't let any other non-Republicans in, those who are loyal.
A North Korean election.
Okay.
It's like the Dictator movie when they've got this voting booth and they've got the other voting booth for the separate party, and everyone gets pushed by a tank to the right party's voting booth. So you've got choice, but not very much. Yeah,
it's far too risky to hold a completely free election. You can't let royalists stand, and you can't let royalists vote. What should you do? And there's a lot of pressure to reform elections as well, and they also need to be seen as legitimate. So there are all these competing issues. And also there's this pressure to kind of reform morally. This is the Puritan streak. That the country needs to be better, that they need to pass laws against adultery and blasphemy and drinking. And so there's this kind of moral reformation. Cromwell becomes really frustrated with them. And there's a really dramatic scene in April 1653 when he kind of storms into the House of Commons and he takes his soldiers with him. And he turfs out all of the MPs that are there. He just says, "I've had enough. You're not a parliament." And the soldiers force them out. It is a military coup. It's a military coup of the kind that we saw in 1648 when Colonel Pride stopped certain MPs even entering the House of Commons because they would block the king going on trial. So we have another use of force to change the direction that the Republic's going to go in. And this is a really key moment, but it's also really difficult to say whether this was premeditated by Cromwell.
I find it so fascinating, this oxymoron of fighting for freedom, but doing it with force and violence. And I guess the question to pose is, do you think it's justified to use that force and violence if it's in the name of this utopia of finally having freedom and the people having power?
Yeah, no, I don't. And also the idea this is for kind of people and the power is very limited. I mean, Cromwell's idea of the people having power was not what the Levellers thought. Cromwell argued against the Levellers' desire, which was that all men over the age of 21 should be allowed to vote. Cromwell thought that no, if we open up the vote to non-propertied men, so men who don't own any property, then all anarchy could arise. He saw that as sort of anarchical. So he's not democratic. But there is a kind of freedom of parliament, I think, which is different, and that's a sense that kind of Parliament has the right to alter government and to bring about the right kind of government. So he's not going to open it up to anyone, but he does want Parliament to. He does acknowledge the kind of the power and the sovereignty of Parliament to a certain extent, apart from when they don't do what he wants them to do, then he gets rid of them. But then he does try to kind of come up with another kind of scheme.
So how do we get to Lord Protector and how does that unfold?
So 1653 is a bit of a crazy year where we have no Parliament at all. They're all kicked out. MPs are absolutely furious about this, really, really cross. And then they come up with an idea that they could have a kind of caretaker parliament that was a group of about 140 men who would be nominated instead of elected. This is a nominated assembly.
It's like a super rump.
Yeah, it's like a super rump, but not even not even with a whiff of election. These are people who are called to their position because of their godliness. And it was kind of mocked as a kind of parliament of saints, because there were some people at the time who did believe that it was okay to use force to bring about a godly kind of parliament. These are the fifth monarchists, another term which you hear and you think, what does that mean? But it's a belief that England is special and is about to become the setting for the second coming of Christ. I mean, we've got to try and inhabit a mindset, and Cromwell shared this belief for a while, that England needed to be thoroughly reformed and needed to be thoroughly godly because it was about to welcome Christ and the fifth and everlasting kingdom as prophesied in the Bible. And this assembly of saints is in that kind of vein, many, not all, but many of the men who were nominated to have a seat in this assembly were millenarians or fifth monarchists who believed that the world was about to end as we know it and Christ was about to come again. But the bare bones is called the bare bones assembly because one of its very godly members is called Praise God Barebone, a very fashionably pious name, but it implodes. It is not seen as legitimate, and it doesn't work. And it's towards the end of 1653 that an army officer, brilliant army officer called John Lambert, who is a kind of constitutional whiz, he has been sort of scheming in the background, and he comes up with a new constitution which goes back to there being a single person in charge. Not a monarchy, but a protectorate. He wonders about the person being a king, so it's a kind of monarchy. And he offers this to Cromwell. Cromwell rejects the title of king, but says, okay, I will be Lord Protector.
So he rejects this title of king where you've got the divine right of rule over the population. You can make these drastic changes and your rule gets passed down in a hereditary fashion. To then become Lord Protectorate, where he's also got the will of God, but just in his own way, different to the monarch before, and he makes drastic changes himself. Does no one see the irony in that?
Oh, many people do. Many people do. And he is mocked for being king-like, and that a protectorate is a kind of an aping monarchy, and that it is a king in all but name. But it's really not. And I think we have to also be very careful with what we understand king to be. To many people, a king was not synonymous with absolute power. For many, particularly those who are very sort of constitutionally minded in Parliament at the time, they understood a king to be a limited form of power.
Well, I think it's even written into the Bible. There are certain constitutions on the powers that a king can have.
There are, it's interesting because there are sort of kingdoms in the Bible, and many Republicans at the time, some people argued that the Bible and God was against kingdoms, and others would argue that God did legitimize kingdoms. So there's sort of conflicting understanding of where kings sort of first came from. But in the ancient constitution of England, when they talk about the ancient constitution and what it used to be, certain parliamentarians are thinking of it being king, commons, and lords. King, House of Lords, House of Commons, working as a kind of coordinate, a kind of triangle of power, and not a king is not synonymous with being kind of with absolute power. That was the kind of king that Charles I was being, and that's not. They saw that as a breach of the ancient constitution. So where are we? We're with a commoner, the first commoner ever to hold the office of the head of state, Oliver Cromwell, not an ounce of royal blood in him, being offered the top job. But it's not a king, it's Lord Protector. He has to govern according to a constitution. There has never been a written constitution in this country before or since the 1650s. And John Lambert wrote a constitution which defined the powers of the Lord Protector to a certain extent. So you said, he could now just do whatever he wanted. Not quite. He had a council. He had to rule in tandem with the Protectoral Council, and then there was the House of Commons who would vote. So they separated the executive from the judiciary. Separation of powers, which was really important. He did have a veto, which meant he could veto certain things. And crucially, the office was not hereditary. It was elective.
I feel it's important to iron this out, because what I mean when I say we go from this hereditary monarchy to trying to get rid of that and it ends up being hereditary is obviously down the line there's the contention for who takes over once Cromwell passes away. And they go, screw it, we're going to put his son in. let's sort of get towards that now and work our way to the end of this decade.
Yeah. Okay, so we shift from being a republic, what's called a Commonwealth, and free state of Commonwealth of England, Ireland and Scotland. It then becomes Protectorate of England, Ireland and Scotland under this constitution with Oliver as Lord Protector. One of the things that's so complicated about this period, but also fascinating to witness if you're interested in such things, is how they just cannot settle with the constitution. There are those who agitate against it being a protectorate. And we really see a kind of republican tradition emerging in this period. Those who are really arguing for a different kind of republic, who don't want there to be a single person at the head, because it does, as you said, look a bit too king-like. It just does. And also, they're really, really worried about what's going to happen when Cromwell dies. They cannot imagine an election. I mean, this is a parliament who cannot really get anything done. They argue all the time. As you can imagine now, if we had a massive constitutional upheaval, can you imagine what the House of Commons would become? It would just deteriorate into bickering. Really, and this is sort of what happened. So it's much more serious than bickering. I mean, this is really like, what are we going to do? And they're really worried about how on earth you would elect a new Lord Protector. So they come up with another idea. A certain group of allies around Cromwell come up with the idea that to actually offer him the title of king again. I think, come on, if you're king again, it might just settle everything. It's a known name. It works in law. They can't really quite define, actually, why it would be so constitutionally, like a piece of constitutional glue to have a king again. But they try it. And I think what they're trying to do is smuggle in hereditary succession, because I think then that would solve the succession problem. If he's a king, Cromwell doesn't want any of it.
And people are writing notes at the time privately into each other, and there seems to be this buzz that they think Cromwell initially is going to take the offer.
Yeah, they absolutely do. And some of his closest allies are writing home to his son, Henry Cromwell, who is looking after things in Ireland, saying, we think he's going to take it. It's just a matter of time. And he doesn't. He deliberates and and his conscience is racked. And after weeks of deliberation, he says to the House of Commons, I won't take it. I'll take everything else. But I won't take that title, the title that God himself has blasted against and tossed in the dust. He does not want the title of king. So what happens? He becomes Lord Protector again. And now the succession is going to be nominated. So it still hasn't become hereditary. He loathes that hereditary way, Cromwell. He said that on a number of occasions, but he's against that hereditary way. It's widely assumed and hoped that he would nominate his son, Richard Cromwell. The legitimacy of hereditary power is still strong. The fear of election, of who would get in, the kind of crisis that might put a country in. It seems that hereditary power trumps all. It doesn't matter whether they've got royal blood in them or not. The eldest son is seen to secure the succession. But Cromwell never nominates him, never formally nominates him. When he's lying, dying in 1658, he sends someone off to his office in Whitehall and says, I did write it on a piece of paper. It's in an envelope on my desk. No one can find it. So another mystery with Cromwell. There are many. What was he thinking? The story goes that on his deathbed he does acquiesce and nominate Richard, but we don't have any formal proof of that. But anyway, his son does succeed. It does go to the eldest son, Richard Cromwell, and he lasts in the job for a year, not even a year. It all collapses very, very quickly.
Is there anything that could have been done that would ensure monarchy would have never returned? Because from my understanding, they never see it that way. They never see it as a permanent solution, this protectorate. They always just wanted to get rid of this tyrant and then potentially get back to monarchy down the line. Could any... Do you disagree with that?
No, I'm interested in that you see it as that it was only a matter of time that monarchy would be restored, and that they I think many people did perceive monarchy to be the most legitimate form of government.
I guess the question is, could something have been done differently, a better solution that could have led to us even now having no monarchy?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because I think if we looked back to 1657, just before Cromwell dies, when the constitution is slightly revised and Cromwell is still as Lord Protector, actually it was working. Things were settling down. There were regular parliaments. The army was quieter. There was still unrest in Parliament a bit with those who didn't like the Protectorate. But if Cromwell hadn't have then died rather suddenly a year later, I think we would have been on a different path. I think, and certainly those in exile with the future Charles II were looking at England thinking, our hopes are dashed. There's no chance that there'll be a restoration now. If Richard the Cromwell had been a slightly different personality, if he had managed the army and the squabbling Republican faction in Parliament, those against the Protectorate, if he'd managed them a bit better, then he might not have been forced to abdicate, and we might be on a different path under the House of Cromwell. Perhaps even further back than that, if Cromwell had even accepted the offer of king and the title of king, but then had died, as he was going to do, but it had become a kingship and Richard Cromwell became king, we might also be on a different path. It might be a monarchy, but it would be the House of Cromwell and a different kind of monarchy. I don't think there was anything inevitable about the Republic falling apart, but I do think it always suffered from being perceived as illegitimate, and never having the full sort of sanction of a full and free Parliament behind it.
Yeah, I guess the main thing that comes to mind, and the reason I say it felt to me as though it was inevitable the whole time, with the benefit of hindsight, obviously, is just this superpower of people believing in God and the institutions all being based on Christianity at the time. You see how much religion impacts other places in the world now, like Saudi Arabia. And if you transfer that back, you've got churches, people gathering, they have all these unwritten expectations of what life involves and written expectations of what life involves. It just seems so tough without becoming completely secular to eliminate this feeling of illegitimacy that plagues the Republic the whole time.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think what you've got with a kind of a king is a kind of double combination of a kind of single person and being able to concentrate power and authority and legitimacy in a single body, but also with their a kind of sacredness and a sacred nature, because you could argue that actually what is so tenacious is the idea of a single person at the head. Doesn't have to be a king who has God on kind of speed dial. It's the what they couldn't shake was being attached to a single person. And when Cromwell was nearly crowned king, Charles Stuart's advisor in exile, Edward Hyde, future Earl of Clarendon, who was he wrote a really famous history of the period, but he wrote that at this time, if Cromwell became king, it didn't matter that he wasn't royal and wasn't of the Stuart family, and didn't have the kind of connection and kind of divine, kind of sacred nature. It was the idea. It was the name of king, and he said, "People like the thing, not the family." And I think that's sort of interesting that they might have been able to. His office might not have been defined as a sacred office, but they could still worship someone who was a single, someone who occupied a position like that, as they do in other countries where is it the religion or is it the wanting to worship a single person that is so powerful?
That's fascinating. I'd love to end with reflecting on that a bit further and pushing it down the line to the present day and looking at what changes were made during the Republic, the Protectorate, the riddance of the monarchy temporarily, and then the return. What features from that period impact us the most today in politics, in the monarchy, either that we rely on or that we still contest to this day?
Yeah. So just to pick up on what we were talking about, I think the idea of the sacred monarch never came back. Never came back. Charles II tried to, and he carried on that very sacred ritual which French and English kings indulged in, which was touching for the king's evil, this particular kind of tuberculosis-like illness, which the king was understood to be able to heal. But that died out at the end of the 17th century. So what we were talking about, that the king being kind of sacred, the king came back, but that element of kingship never did come back, because it was always understood that you could touch the royal body, that you could kill them, execute them. There was an alternative. And at the coronation of Charles II, the spectre of rebellion haunts that whole coronation. They know that it could go another way. And what comes in is the idea that you kind of consent to monarchy. It's not an indisputable fact anymore. And that has persisted. And it might well be that is why we haven't had a revolution again, because what came in was a kind of acceptance that a consent to monarchy, and a consent to the kind of fiction that monarchy is, that it might be the best form of government, but it's not the only form of government, that it is dressed up with all this kind of sacredness, but that is something that we buy into rather than fully believe. And, within 25 years of the Restoration, we have constitutional monarchy that is put on the books. The ideas of constitutional monarchy have been sown at this time. They were sown in the 1640s, limited monarchy. The Protectorate was a form of a constitutional monarchy. Charles II comes back with no kind of conditions, but within 25 years, William and Mary come to the throne, 28 years, 1688, and they rule as constitutional monarchs. And then constitutional monarchy really starts to develop and become bedded down as in the constitution that they work with Parliament.
It's so fascinating. Just the point you picked up earlier on the fact that people worship the person. And it seems as though this whole period, even just looking at it downstream now, it's a great look into human behavior and how societies operate. Because even today, we have our constitutional monarchy. But in my opinion, it's completely unsupported by any of the beliefs of our society. There's no way of really actually logically rationalizing it if you really boil down to it. I mean, people don't believe now that the king has the divine right from God, and he's still called Your Highness, but higher than who? So there's that sort of cognitive dissonance that we all will recognize if we drill into it, but we all sort of just put off because it works and it's history and it's Britain, and we don't want to get rid of that.
Yeah. Well, I think the story that Britain has told itself, which I think goes back to this period, is that we are we're not a revolutionary country. It didn't work. We prefer stability and tradition and continuity, and the monarchy is a symbol of that. It has always been. We slightly paper over this period as an aberration. It didn't work, forgetting that actually it's probably even due to this period that we have the kind of monarchy that we have. And yes, I agree, it is a kind of sentimental attachment and a wanting to buy into the story of continuity and stability, that somehow as if it would, you'd lose a monarch and the whole country would fall apart. Because I think the alternative is, people don't want the alternative. How they see that a figurehead who is somehow above politics is better than an elected head of state, a figurehead who is there just by birthright. And I think you're right. That's a very good way of putting it. There is a kind of dissonance between what we would understand to be what we understand about meritocracy and equality, and people being kind of represented, wanting to be represented properly by those in power. It completely falls apart with the monarchy. And yet there is something very powerful there, which we have to try and understand. I don't know. I wanted to write this book to try and understand that. Why are we so addicted to monarchy in this country? I'm not sure I've fully answered it, but it's a very powerful idea. The idea of and that's what we saw at the coronation, was the playing out of a really, really old idea, the idea of a king.
Professor Alice Hunt, thank you so much for coming on The Next Generation. Your book is amazing. I'd strongly recommend everyone checks out Republic, Britain's Revolutionary Decade. And I think that there is going to be change in the future with Gen Z, my age, growing up and not having that same attachment to the monarchy. It's going to be absolutely fascinating to see how that all unfolds. And this has definitely given me a better understanding and a better grip on the monarchy and why things are the way they are today. So thank you. Where can people find more of your work?
Oh, well, you can go on to, if you look me up at Professor Alice Hunt at the University of Southampton, then all of my work is listed there, and I'm on Blue Sky and Twitter, and happy to hear from people always.